Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for coming. My name's, if you don't know me, Father Jonathan Jameson. I'm the Associate Rector here at St. John's Church. This is, I think, the 8th of our Sunday night sessions. I'm going to space them out a little bit more next year, but we've had some amazing talks, and I'm really grateful for all those who kept coming back, and for all of you coming out tonight in this inclement weather. You're very brave, and I think it's going to be well worth your time. So a couple quick announcements before we get going. First off, there's these all around, and on the back they have a little QR code. And if you haven't and you'd like to donate to offset food and drink costs, you can, QR that and send some money. That'd be great. We'd appreciate it. We're really thankful. First, let's also give a hand to all the Elegant 8+ who have done an amazing job catering this whole time. Really grateful for them and for everyone who's worked to make these really wonderful events. So there will be more to come, but probably not for a little while. We'll take a little bit of time to rest. And secondly, I'll give an introduction and then I'll say what I mean to say. So we're really excited to have Dr. Tara Burton with us tonight to discuss her new book, Self-Made. This book also is being sold by E. Shaver over there. Talk to Jessica. She's only taking card, so hopefully you have your credit cards with you. And then Tara will be up for signing and talking to you about the book afterwards. So after the Q&A, you can move over there, and I hope that lots of you buy books. I think there's 20-something books, and so if they don't all sell, I'm going to come after you, okay? So, but I'm trying to remember when I first encountered Dr. Burton, or should I say Tara?
Say Tara.
Okay, Tara's work. I think it was just sort of, the big one eventually that came out was a Times article about weird Christianity, about how there's, people were sort of sick of normal everyday life, and Christianity, the weirdness of it, the resurrection, the virgin birth, liturgy, all these things were exciting and strange again, and it was good news to people. And I can very much relate to that, so I'm thankful for the article. And it had a big response, and I think for good reason. And it's something that we relate to here at St. John's Church. So, and then I've sort of followed her work. She wrote an excellent book called Strange Rites about sort of contemporary religious culture. That's actually somewhat similar to Dave Zoll was here 2 weeks ago, and so his book about seculosity, it's pretty similar, and talks about that same religious instinct that's in us all and the way that it gets worked out in sort of various ways in our modern society, often in a sort of consumeristic way. But I'm not going to give the talk, so I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Burton as she discusses her new book, and then think about the questions you want to ask. It can be about this book, about what it means to be, what the modern self is, or it could be about liturgy, or it could be about anything. So be thinking about the questions you want to ask. We're going to have a good discussion a little bit. But let's welcome Tara Burton.
Oh my gosh, thank you all so much for having me and for coming out in this sort of miserable gale. I flew in through it this morning. It was tempestuous. But so I'm here to talk ostensibly about this idea of self-creation. And one of the things that I find really interesting in this book that started as a book about the creation of the self, the dandy, the Beau Brummels, the Oscar Wildes, the entrepreneurs, the self-made men, as they historically often were, the Andrew Carnegies and what have you, I found that I was actually writing a book that wasn't just about making the self. It was about a book about thinking about what it actually means to be a self. The question at the heart of Self-Made is what makes us who we truly are, what makes us who we authentically, to use a very popular modern term, are. What makes us us? Not something anyone has ever successfully answered, not something I could even claim for a moment to try to answer. But in thinking about this distinctly modern phenomenon of self-curation, of self-conception, whether it's online in our social media avatars, whether it's in terms of living our best lives or creating our best lives, are the things that make us us, the things that we have control over, or the things we don't, the things we choose, or the things that happen to us. So, as I start a more kind of targeted part of this lecture, I kind of want to invite you to kind of hold in your mind that bigger question, a question that vexes me every day as a writer, as a culture critic, and as a Christian. So I would like to start this lecture. That's a lie. I've already started this lecture. I would like to continue this lecture by inviting you to consider one particular advertising campaign from January of 2020 from the high-end boutique fitness chain Equinox. So it's produced by a marketing studio called Droga 5, and this campaign is entitled Make Yourself a Gift to the World. And it features a series of images devoted to the ideal gym goer as a kind of mythological demigod of self-care. One of the posters features a powerful woman who is easily lifting up two men like the biblical Samson. Another features a shirtless man lying on a funeral pyre, attended by frenetic worshipers. The purpose of this campaign, according to the marketing firm who gave an interview about it, was to depict, quote, divine characters as God-like gifts to the world in moments and situations that reflect their self-worship as serving a larger purpose to humanity. Asking the question, this is also a quote, does that not make self-obsession the most selfless act of all? Or as one Equinox chief marketer told the journalist, we are targeting individuals dedicated to becoming the very best we can be because, quote, when you become the best version of yourself, you radiate outward and contribute more to the world around you. It's getting very warm, so I'm going to take this off as I continue. So Equinox maybe is not fully representative of contemporary American culture in 2023. It's a very expensive gym, about $300 a month. You're locked into these contracts. They're also very famous for very intentionally transgressive ads. There was one year where they didn't let new members join in January because they said, like, we don't want those of you who just come to the gym for your New Year's resolution. We want real athletes. So this is a marketing strategy. But I think it's a really useful window into what I think of as a kind of implicit civil religion in the United States in 2023. The idea that not only can we make ourselves, create ourselves, but that we should, that this is a moral obligation, that if we do not do that, we have somehow failed in the business of being human. If we have not lived our best lives, created our best lives, wrestled the raw material of nature and culture and relationships into the shape of our dreams, we screwed up. We didn't do what the universe or God or the energy out there or whatever is the kind of nebulous conception of the divine that sort of suffuses so much of contemporary cultural rhetoric, or we just didn't do the human thing right. And I think that this is something that we don't just see in Equinox ads. I think this is something very common, whether one is like about 36% of young millennials and about coming up on 30% of Americans actually, religiously unaffiliated, spiritual but not religious, et cetera, whether you self-identify or you think of yourself as a Christian, but are still perhaps involved in, caught up in this cultural miasma. I was reflecting on this on my way over here that I, who hope to think of myself as a believing Christian, sometimes still find that voice in my head saying, I do all the right things. I deserve the life that I want because I did the right things. Like, this is just part of how we so easily talk about what it means to be human. And I argue in Self-Made, which is a history of this self-curation. The title officially is From daVinci to the Kardashians because that's what the publisher wanted me to say. Really, it's more like from Albrecht Dürer to Caroline Calloway and OnlyFans, but they thought Dürer was too obscure and OnlyFans was too risque. But roughly, the Renaissance to the internet age. And I believe that this idea that what it means to be human is to create ourselves, not just to tell our own story, but to decide our own purpose. That is a distinctly modern idea. It is also, and I say this as a theologian, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a theologian, everything looks like a theology problem. This is a story about theology. This is a story about the relocation of the authority of what our purpose is, what we ought to do with our own lives, from God, from a creator God who has made us in his image and his likeness, who has made us for a purpose, who has created a world in which all of us together work towards some higher end we may not fully understand, towards a world in which, as the sort of hippie, visionary internet entrepreneur Stuart Brand famously said in the 60s and 70s, we are as gods and we might as well get good at it. This is, in a sense, what I actually wanted to call the subtitle of this book is Self-Made, How We Became Gods. I was told that wouldn't sell, but I was able to get it in the introduction. So there we are. So the question of how do we make ourselves really starts let me rephrase that. The question of who is the self-creator and what kind of special individual is the self-creator, we really start seeing for the first time in the Renaissance. And it's a time of, I don't want to bore you all with a recap of all of the social and economic developments of the Renaissance, but a time of increased social mobility, of increased literacy and education, the sort of burgeoning middle class, especially an artisan and mercantile middle class. There develops this notion of the genius, the someone who is special, who doesn't quite fit in to existing social categories. And this is a sort of contrast to a sort of, one might say, a medieval notion, a medieval Christian notion of the social world, the natural world, all being part of a holistic God-given whole. God has made the flowers and the bees and the trees, and God has made kings and princes and priests and peasants, and who we are socially as well as biologically as well as spiritually is made by God. And so these figures, these sort of, whether they're daVinci or Albrecht Dürer in Germany or humanist scholars like Poggio Bracciolini, they don't quite fit in this paradigm. How do you account for these sort of social climbers who have something about them that doesn't quite, they're not aristocrats exactly, but they are propelling themselves into aristocratic circles. And the idea of genius really comes into the forefront at this time, but it's specifically an idea that, very importantly, is that these people are just plain special, and they are chosen by God, by fortune, by nature. Different humanists sort of give different accounts. But there is this idea that there is some, I liken it in my book to the idea of the bastard, the illegitimate child, the sort of demigod of a mortal woman and Zeus in classical mythology, which is actually an image that is used many times to talk about a number of Renaissance artists, including Giotto and actually daVinci. Sure, the technical legal father of this, young upstart is an apothecary or a blacksmith or what have you, but his real father, and it is usually him, is God, is nature, is fortune. He has some kind of direct, unmediated line to divinity that ordinary people don't have. And that does something really interesting rhetorically, which is it, on the one hand, allows for a vision of a kind of person who can transcend the social order, but it also puts limits on it. Some people are special and some aren't. And this is one of the strains of this sort of story of self-creation, that some people who can transcend their social circumstances have a mysterious and maybe godlike quality. But that's only half the story. I like to say that every time in history there is a conception of a secret, godlike, mysterious quality that makes people better than other people, there's a bunch of self-help books getting published that tell you how to fake it. And in the case of the Renaissance, that is Baldassare Castiglione's 1528 Book of the Courtier, a sort of handbook for would-be nobles, where this idea is introduced of sprezzatura. Also true, a lot of these terms are always untranslatable. Sprezzatura in Italian, it literally means something like nonchalance or elegance, but it's hard to, it means sprezzatura. And the idea behind it is this, that for a genius, everything is effortless. You don't have to work at being a genius because you just are. God has given you this magical talent, and from the time, you find this in stories of Giotto, you find this in stories of daVinci. From the time you're 5 years old, you can, paint the most beautiful thing in the world, and you don't have to try. But if you have sprezzatura, you can fake it. If you can make things look effortless, you're not a genius, but nobody else knows you're not a genius. You can shape yourself by shaping the perceptions of others. And then there's a sort of third question, which is this sort of implicit other thing going on, especially when we're talking about the rise of a bourgeois middle class, which is this something that comes from hard work? Can you get this through sort of elbow grease and grit? And especially as we move on and this sort of narrative takes its form in the United States, the American dream of good, old-fashioned hard work. So you have fundamentally these three visions of the sort of person who can create their own self, who can create their own identity both socially, but also in terms of managing public perceptions of themselves. And indeed, many of these Renaissance geniuses, especially Albrecht Dürer, famously the inventor of the selfie, his 1501 self-portrait, was not only was it among the first sort of self-portraits to really put the artist front and center, but also he basically used traditional iconographic depictions of Jesus. He's looking straight at the viewer, his hands are raised in a certain way, to sort of indicate, he's not quite doing this, but he basically is. The artist is divine. But at the same time, these are sort of undertone, this other question of the artist is divine, or he's able to make people think that he's divine, or there's secretly hard work going on behind the scenes. And this is absolutely the tension at the heart of what it means to be a self-creator. It's like for those of you familiar with like the famous Maybelline ad, like maybe she's born with it, maybe it's Maybelline. It's sort of like that, but historically. So that is sort of the thing one that I want to leave you with, are thinking about the sort of these questions of the Renaissance as they transform first through the Enlightenment, then through the 19th century into the present. These questions are the same questions that keep getting asked over and over. The second point that I want to make about these early centuries of debate over self-creation is something that I call in my book the disenchantment of custom, that I see as happening very much in the European Enlightenment, particularly, but not exclusively, in France. And you can find this, for example, in Montaigne, in Diderot, in pretty much any Enlightenment philosophe you can name. But it goes something like this. These things we do as human beings, these relationships we have, these social roles we play, the clothing that we wear, we've been taught that these are just how things are, how God intended things, how God made us to be. But maybe they're not. Maybe they're just custom. Maybe they're just arbitrary. And you start to see in the Enlightenment a whole genre of texts specifically exploring this idea of what is really natural and what is simply custom. And if it is custom, is it subject to change? We often find this, especially in the writings of Montaigne and Diderot, framed as and inspired by encounters with the so-called New World, or with what they would have referred to as primitive peoples. There's a lot of obviously fictionalized travelers' tales where either someone goes to Tahiti or a Persian diplomat comes to Paris, and the fundamental idea is, wow, people there do things differently from here. This is a little often to do with sex. There's a lot of people over there have a lot more exciting free sex, and over here we're restrained and restricted. But fundamentally, the idea is that what the things that provide our social relationships to one another, our social lives, are simply the result of power and custom and ignorance, and they are subject to change. We can desire to make those things different if we so want to, especially when it comes to liberation and acting on what we want and seeking our own power. And these two ideas, basically the sort of divinization of the genius and the disenchantment of circumstance, ultimately come to reform and recreate the idea of what it means to be really a human being, to be really ourselves. Are we people who are shaped by our surroundings, shaped by God, shaped by our societies? Or are we trapped by false assumptions about what God wants from us, trapped by false assumptions and restrictions of society? And really, the way to become an enlightened human being, a fully fledged human being, an adult human being, if we think about Immanuel Kant's famous definition of enlightenment, man, where the enlightenment is cutting the leading strings, where how toddlers would be led along by their parents in pursuit of a kind of autonomous maturity, a maturity that is about not being reliant on other people. So this sort of theological shift fundamentally goes into two directions. My book, I call them the aristocratic and the democratic. You could also call them the American and the European. I'll take you briefly through the European because I want to focus on the American because that's where we are. And I think it's, in some senses, more relevant to where we are today in 2023. But in Europe, the sort of idea of the innate specialness of a certain kind of person, the figure of the dandy, later the Übermensch, becomes the sort of predominant way that this is theorized. It's a sort of, I feel like there's often a misconception that, particularly because everyone loves Oscar Wilde so much, that the dandy is a kind of liberatory figure. He's sexy, he's a little bit risque, he's free. But the dandy, whether we're talking about Beau Brummel in the Regency era or Oscar Wilde towards the end of the 19th century, or the French analogues that fewer people in the English-speaking world have heard of, like Barbie d'Aurevilly, it's actually quite a reactionary idea. It's against this tide of democratization and industrialization, and in a world where the old pre-French Revolutionary social hierarchies are receding, there is something that makes some people better than others. And it can't be aristocracy anymore. It can't be money. It becomes style. It becomes flair. It becomes a certain unnameable thing. So instead of sprezzatura, we have, for example, in Regency England, bon ton, untranslatable, this time from French, but literally means good manners, but really means something kind of like sprezzatura, a mysterious force that of an aristocracy of style, an aristocracy of wit. It is a creation of a new kind of special person. And this idea starts out very much as a aesthetic idea. Early dandies like Beau Brummel are very much they're fashion plates. They're in Brummel's case, he's the original inventor of sponsored content. He literally, tailors will give him stuff for free because they know that when he wears it, everyone will buy it. So it's sort of deeply tied up in the idea of advertising and creating your own self in order to perhaps have certain kinds of profit. But this idea kind of intensifies, and in my mind gets a little bit darker throughout the 19th century, particularly under the influence of Friedrich Nietzsche, himself a sort of quasi-failed dandy who's influenced by a lot of these ideas, who reimagines the dandy as the Übermensch, that in a world where, as Nietzsche famously says, God is dead, where the old values do not apply, where they do not make any sense, the real superior being is the one who can bend the world to his will, who is able to, whether it's by exercising will, by giving style to his life. Nietzsche was very much interested in the idea of the aesthetic life, or whether it's by convincing other people to do what you want. The Übermensch is able to kind of exert control as a result of what he wants. His desires shape reality around him. Why? Because there is no other arbiter of reality. There is no God in this conception of things. There is no creator. There is no moral telos to the universe other than human desire. And that is something that I argue reaches its sort of culmination sort of historically, or at least a sort of particular historical culmination in those who were influenced by Nietzsche, particularly Mussolini and the Italian fascists, and ultimately into the sort of Nazi vision of the Übermensch. But meanwhile, across the pond, something seemingly very different, but I argue quite similar is happening. And that is the vision of the good old-fashioned American hard work, the work, as Frederick Douglass famously says in his lecture on the self-made man, where by applying yourself and bootstrapping your way up, and you can have a certain kind of life, you deserve a certain kind of life. Now, first glance, this sounds nothing like the dandy. There's nothing innate about this. This is about hard work and character and virtue. And I will say that I think in the case of some of the earliest sort of American theorists of self-making, there is a very strong virtue ethicist tradition. There is this idea that political self-governance can only come from personal self-governance. And so hard work is not just about getting money or raising your social station. It's about legitimizing the great American experiment that human beings do have the power to govern themselves. A really sort of surprising thing that I learned in my research was that Frederick Douglass, born into chattel slavery, wrote an essay on temperance from drunkenness, where he argued that if we could only get slave owners sober, slavery would stop in America. That it was that this idea that moral self-control and political liberation were inextricably intertwined. That sort of the thing that what we like self-control and certain kinds of work and self-making were a practice of civic virtue. Unfortunately, that conception of the self-made man didn't last very long. The early 18th century, you find all of these sort of secular hagiographies, early 19th century and late 18th century. You find these secular hagiographies of self-made men, like Douglass, like a little bit later on Abraham Lincoln, that celebrate this kind of civic model. But by the Gilded Age, something else and much more similar to what's going on in Europe starts to happen. This vision of being able to basically control reality by controlling perception. And the idea of the self-made man goes from a kind of industrious, virtuous, middle-class figure to being the robber barons, the people who get all the spoils, winner takes all capitalism. Just a quick show of hands, who here is familiar with the New Thought? All right, we got one maybe and a lot of no's, so I'll do this really quickly. So New Thought, I believe, is the single most under-recognized spiritual force in America today and historically. Starts in the 1860s. There's a clockmaker in New Hampshire named Phineas Quimby, who is also a faith healer. And he's not a very good faith healer. He doesn't seem to heal people very well. And he wonders, why is this not working? Is it me that's the problem? No, it must be the patient. The patient must not want to get better. And he comes up with this idea that it's positive thinking on the part of the patients, on the part of the people who are not getting well, that separates the people that his faith healing works on from the people that it doesn't work on. And he doesn't write anything down himself, but his students do, including Mary Baker Eddy, founder of Christian Science tradition, but where the idea is basically, it's a sort of a mashup of pop science about natural selection, pop science about electricity and magnetism, a little bit of Christianity, and a lot of spiritualism. But the idea is that there's sort of forces out there in the universe, currents that you can harness, and you can harness them by looking within yourself. If you want something badly enough, it will happen. This starts originally as a kind of purely medical phenomenon. This is about faith healing. But by the time we get to the sort of Gilded Age, there is self-help book after self-help book about using this to get rich. If you picture yourself wealthy, you will get money. If you imagine the vibes of wealth and success, it will happen to you. And if it doesn't happen to you, it means you didn't want it badly enough. And this is used over and over in all of these, dozens and really hundreds of self-help books, many of which become massive bestsellers, not just to kind of tantalize people with the promise of wealth, but also to justify cutting back on social services, to justify minimizing state support for the poor, because obviously these people just didn't want it badly enough. And what ends up happening in a much less sort of explicitly nihilistic way, in a much more kind of spiritualized, maybe sort of, you might even say proto-New Agey way, becomes this sort of theological idea that what if we want something badly enough, if our desires are strong enough, the universe will shape itself around our desires. And so these two very different narratives ultimately come to the same conclusion. What we want makes us who we are. And that the greatest power, the closest thing to divinity, the closest thing to a godlike force in the world is human desire and the human will. These two narratives ultimately, as they're running in parallel. There's a little bit of crossover, but where they finally converge, I'm going to see how much time I have left. Good, I have a little. I can finish my lecture in exactly the time I hoped. Where it converges is Hollywood. A lot of things happen in Hollywood, but the idea of the Hollywood starlet, of it, again, like sprezzatura, like bon ton, a mysterious force that creates some people that are somehow better than others, that have the ability to sway others to their will, that are godlike beings, basically starts to fuse the aristocratic and democratic model together. The Hollywood star, plucked from obscurity, doesn't necessarily have talent exactly, they don't have looks exactly, they have it. Now, it, for those of you who are not, old Hollywood movie buffs, comes from a 1920 short story by a writer named Eleanor Glynn in Cosmopolitan about this mysterious quality that basically attracts everyone to you if you have it. Again, it's innate, it's godlike, it's mysterious. It gets, someone recognizes a hit here, it gets optioned for $50,000, which is no small sum in today's money. It is made into a movie with Clara Bow. In it, Clara Bow, flapper, vamp, she's just this shop girl who, attracts the heart of her employer, a wealthy, the owner of the department store where she works, not because she's beautiful exactly. He has a wealthy fiance who's also beautiful, not because of any particular qualities, not because she's, virtuous or good. She just has it. And this idea, but what's important about it is it's not, unlike, in the case of daVinci, it's not an actual talent for anything. It's having something special about your own personality that makes people basically want to do what you want. And this idea that the star has this kind of godlike power goes, once again, hand in hand with a cottage industry of self-help and advertisements trying to help convince ordinary Americans that if they could only buy the right products, if they could only do the right things, maybe they too could have their special, unique personality discovered and make them into a star. And then that question comes again: is it innate? Is it learned? Is it worked on? Well, finally, the sort of narratively speaking, the needle starts to get threaded. And the way that I like to describe that fusion comes from a 1928 advertisement for a correspondence course called Personal Magnetism. And it was sort of advertised in a bunch of magazines. And the tagline for this correspondence course, which is, of course, for sale, is this: you have it. Everyone has it. But not one person in 100 knows how to use it. And this idea that maybe your unique personality is like the hard work, the self-presentation and kind of self-shaping and the innateness come together in this idea that maybe everyone has it, but the it that matters is knowing how to use your own self, knowing how to not just present, but kind of harness and channel your own self to be the person you want to be. And I think it is precisely that model, that kind of liminal space between some special human beings as gods and and you just didn't work hard enough or want it badly enough if you failed. We basically got the worst of all worlds in the way that both celebrity culture and sort of broader American ways that we think about wealth and success and shaping our own identities have developed. We truly are, authentically are, or so this contemporary narrative goes, who we most want to be. And the way that we shape our own selfhood is by wanting it badly enough and going after what we want. And I think particularly, every technological, major technological media invention since celluloid, since the silver screen, has only intensified that. We can think of, for example, the development of television. We can think of the development of the personal camcorder, the camera. We can think of the age of Andy Warhol and his sort of celebrities were famous for being famous, who just sort of decided that they were going to be stars, and so they were. And we can think about it in the age of the internet as having gone into overdrive. We live now in an era where what we want does, in fact, shape the reality that we see a lot of the time. It shapes what we see on our screens. Those of us, whether we are working remotely or not, we're probably spending, 5 hours a day on our phones or on our computers on some screen. What we look at changes according to what we want. That's how algorithms work. We click one thing and an advertisement for it follows us around the internet. We click one news source and more sources from that same perspective appear towards us on our social media feeds. Our lives run on an architecture now of desire. And I think that there is something very, spiritual is the wrong word. There is a theological dimension to that. Many of the early pioneers of the internet age who came out of the 60s counterculture, who were inspired by and kind of downstream of a lot of these cultural trends I've been talking about, saw that as a good thing. Finally, with the invention of the internet, and you find this in Stuart Brand, you find this in Theodore Roszak, you find this in John Perry Barlow's 1991 Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace as a manifesto for this. Fun fact, he was also a lyricist for the Grateful Dead. This idea, finally, we are liberated from our physical bodies. We are liberated from our geographic communities. We are liberated from custom, all those pesky things that we did not choose. We are free at last to be who we truly are, if we define who we truly are as what we want to be. And I think about this a lot because I'm guilty of it too. I let myself, as I think many of us do, perhaps in America in 2023, perhaps it's just a human thing to do, it becomes so easy to think, I am in control of my life and I do everything right. And I'm going to speak from a Christian perspective here. I don't sort of want to make assumptions about everyone in the room. Some of you are priests, so I'm going to make some assumptions. But I think that there is, what I find so striking and what I am constantly humbled in having to remember is there is nothing more at odds with the Christian gospel than the idea that we can make ourselves, that we deserve a certain kind of life because we went to the right schools or worked hard. Bad things happen to good people all the time. This is something that the Christian tradition has wrestled with, the Odyssey. Why does God allow evil? And to kind of reduce it, as I think we so often do in 2023 in our celebration of individual choice and individual freedom, is to forget how much of who we are is given in terms of being created by God, as I believe, but also in terms of the way that we are shaped by our families, by our friendships, by our relationships, by our communities, by the people we love, by the people who hurt us, and to fail as a culture as profoundly as I think we have, to recognize our profound interdependence, our profound vulnerability to one another, the fact that even if we do everything right, that doesn't guarantee anything, and the assumption that it should, all it does is divorces us from the incredible, complicated sense of reality. Now, I am not, there is a conservative school of thought, particularly in some Christian circles, who say, all of this liberal modernity is bad, we should just go back to Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, and kings were kings, and peasants were peasants. I don't believe that. I believe that this story, there is so much good here in the story of self-making, the vision of Frederick Douglass's optimism about an American experiment where people who looked like him had the same opportunities or could have the same opportunities as the sons of counts and princes, as he talks about when he talks about the way things are in Europe. And I don't want to lose sight of the best of the promise of self-making, which I think is the promise that we are not reducible to our circumstances. We are not reducible to our class or our birth or our blood or our race. We are not reducible to anything at all. What makes us us, and I think that this is the best of the self-making tradition, is something that cannot be called anything else, reduced to anything else. I'm a Christian, so I'll call it a soul. But I think I don't think you have to call it that. Maybe I do, and I'm trying to be inclusive. But I think that there is an irreducibility to the human person that must be celebrated. But I encourage all of you, as we continue talking and thinking about this, to reflect on perhaps the way that contemporary American culture has occluded the harder parts of being human. We live in an era of seemingly unprecedented choice, and we're still all going to die. Unless you believe a couple of those like transhumanists in Silicon Valley. They're really, really sure that they'll get a cure for death eventually. I disagree with them. But we are all mortal. And, this is nothing new. I'm not saying anything, Shakespeare hasn't said. What a piece of work is a man. We're like an angel and quintessence of dust at the same time. We are animals, and we are something more than animals. We are mortal, and we are something more than mortal. And that tension, I think, that frustrating tension is what makes us human. And, I don't have the answer to what makes us us, but the closest thing to what I've got is that horrible, difficult, beautiful push-pull between the dizzying power we have to tell our own stories and decide things and make choices and imagine and invent, and the fact that at the end of the day, we are mortal beings who are shaped as much by not just nature and floods and biology, but by one another. We are social animals, and that's really hard and confusing and weird and wonderful, and we can't really do anything about that no matter how much we try to self-make. So thank you all for listening. Apologize if I got a little sermon-y there, but I look forward to your questions about self-made, about strange rights, about absolutely anything you like. Let's keep talking.
Tara, thank you. That was a really beautiful talk. Right? What a lot to think about, and I'm thankful for it already. But I'm excited about even digging more deeply with you all. So you sort of spoke about this, but I want to look at it a little bit more. So my wife is in fashion, and then my background is music, and so there's a beauty to certain artists, right? There's a beauty to, I was thinking of like David Bowie or like Alexander McQueen or like The Strokes or even Kanye. I mean, I know he's controversial, but like, there's that sort of ability to do something unique and inspiring, and we've all been inspired by that. But then there's like, with fashion especially, you see it, like, it's a sort of, it devours you eventually too, because it's always changing, always moving. You have to keep doing the next step. So like, I mean, in some ways, you acknowledge that, right? Like, it's not that this is all bad and we should just give in to determinism, but there's also like a sort of evil if we imagine that we have to constantly remake ourselves, otherwise we're going to get devoured. So, as a Christian, I don't know, do you have anything more to say about that? 'Cause it's,
I do. I have so much to say about David Bowie.
Good, okay.
So thank you for asking. So I got into all of this long before I was a Christian, because I was a 13-year-old theater kid who loved Oscar Wilde. Like, I was the most, like, I wanted to be a dandy. I wanted to live my life as art. If you found my teenage live journal, please don't look it up. It is somewhere out there on the internet. You would find, like, ramblings about how to have this poetic existence. My doctoral thesis, which was in theology, but it was on theology of dandyism in the 19th century, looking at the weird French people no one has ever heard of, rather than Oscar Wilde. But, well, maybe some of you have heard of them, but their names are really long, so I'm not going to get into it. But so here is what I have come to, and I have a soft spot for these guys. Like, every time I write critically of dandyism, there's a part of me being like, but they're so fun. And here's what I think is the best of what ought to be preserved, and that is irreducibility. A lot of the dandyism, particularly later in the 19th century, comes about at a time of like what Walter Benjamin called, the era of mechanical reproduction. there's, suddenly everything is mass produced. There are department stores. You can get consumer goods really cheaply. Everyone can get the same thing. And I think that maybe this isn't, the dandies weren't necessarily aware that this is what they were doing. They didn't have they didn't have a manifesto. Barbara did in fact have a manifesto, but it wasn't about this. But this idea that in an era where everything starts to feel reproducible, how do you guarantee that you are not yourself reproducible? How do you guarantee that you are not a robot? There's a whole 19th century anxiety about like robots and accidentally sleeping with a robot. That's a big one actually. But like robots could be all around us. And so being a self-creator at its worst, I've talked a bit about what it is at its worst, but at its best is a kind of affirmation of irreducible humanity. I'm a dandy and my clothing is hand sewn and I make myself just so, and you cannot mistake me for everybody else. And I think that that is not just a dandiest impulse. I think that, and I love Jerry Manley Hopkins. I love the myself, it speaks and spells, that sort of idea of self-disclosure is a fundamental thing that human beings do. And I think that at its best, dandyism can be a way to call attention to one of the things that we all do as human beings, which is not just to tell stories, but it's to want to be known and to want to be loved for who we are, and to, even if we don't know ourselves who we are, to try and express who we are constantly. I always love, I don't know how many of you have ever watched the Pokemon. As a kid, I liked the Pokemon show. All the Pokemon say their own name, and then you wander around, and Bulbasaur says Bulbasaur, and Pikachu says Pikachu. And I think we do that as human beings. We don't know that we're doing this, but we're always kind of trying to say our own name to other people and hope that we will be recognized. And I think that, if there is a Christian dandyist tradition, maybe we can start it, who knows? It is that desire to honor our need not just to tell story. So I think that there's a vision of storytelling, especially in the 19th century, where storytelling gets kind of coded as weird and vampiric and kind of sexual, as storytelling as mastery, storytelling as power. We find this in sort of contemporary ideas of disinformation and memes and warfare, sort of mimetic warfare, rather whoever can control the narrative controls reality. And that I think is despicable and possibly demonic. But the version of it that is, we are trying to express a truth to other people, that we should hold on to. Sorry, I don't know if that really answered your question or just around your question. But.
No, love it. It's great. Thank you. There's more I could ask there, but I wanted to ask another one because I almost tried to force you to give a talk I floated it. I was trying to get you to talk about this, and I wonder if you might have something to say about it. Now I'm going to force you to make a 2-minute talk on it.
Yay!
Yeah. So obviously we're a weird church. We're the 28 prayer book church. It's distinctive in that way. And so your book Strange Rites is interesting in the fact that it's a lot about the sort of liturgy as personal expression in some ways almost. And so I wondered what you might say about a place like us, who's sort of old hat. The theme I was thinking of is traditional liturgy in an age of strange rites. So how does that ring with you? And do you have anything to say about what we might offer?
I only get 2 minutes.
Well, okay, go.
All right.
Stretch it. It's all right.
So for those of you who don't know, my first nonfiction book, Strange Rites, is about the kind of wellness, witchcraft, weird American religious landscape, particularly the spiritual but not religious. The idea, in short, is that we all create our own bespoke religions. It's the age of the internet, everything is bespoke, so are our religious identities. That's basically it. This article I read in 2020 about the interest in weird, traditionalist, often liturgical Christianity, written before before the popularity of podcasts like Red Scare, where it became much more right-coded and much more kind of a popular meme in certain literary circles, especially in New York City, is this idea that people were drawn aesthetically to the sort of anti-modern notion of, we don't do all this sort of internet stuff, we do something old, we do something pure. It's something I've written about, actually my second novel, The World Cannot Give, is about a teenager who gets really into weird liturgy. with disastrous and murderous results. But not autobiographical.
We won't have the youth group read that one.
But I'm torn about this question. I go to an Anglo-Catholic parish. I consider myself Anglo-Catholic. I really love the traditional liturgy. For me, the best of it, the most beautiful part of it, is losing my voice in the voice of those who have come before, in participating in something verbally, musically, that is communal. There are people who have said these words. If I am sad, if I am weeping, there are other people who have come weeping, or happy, or in a good mood, or maybe they're just like bored or hungry. But like thousands of years of people, sort of, have said. Hundreds of years of people have said these words, and there is such power in giving oneself over to that. I think also in terms, I used to want to be a theater director before I became an academic instead, because clearly that was the more like sensible, practical choice. But the sort of what theater does so well is it makes us aware of how slippery reality is. It's not that we create a different reality, but that different realities are opened up through participation. And as a theater kid, that being part of that, to me, is helpful to my faith. All that said, I worry. And I worry about the fetishization of liturgical traditionalism. I worry about, and I've seen this, including with I've done this, I've seen friends of mine do this, it becomes easy to one-up your liturgy knowledge. It becomes easy to be like, oh, you used that prayer book? Yeah, well, okay, all right for you, I guess. And I think that that sort of, I was also teenage goth for a while. It happens in every subculture, and it becomes this kind of subcultural posturing of, I know the cool thing. I was into this prayer book before it was cool. We do it like this here. Yes, I know every minor actor in that episode of Star Trek. It's the same thing. And I think that at its worst, a kind of a lack of humility about, if you are not as comfortable praying one-on-one, with words from the heart with someone who is weeping, as you are in a church, or not to say as comfortable, because everyone has their own, ways to God, but if you kind of look down on a genuine approach to finding God that's not through that, if there's a sort of aesthetic superiority to it, something has gone very wrong. And I say that as someone who loves the liturgy stuff, even as I have to check my own love for it sometimes.
Thank you. No, I get that, absolutely. Well, let's open it up. You all have had all this time to think of great questions. So, all right, the guy in the front.
Dr. Burton, thank you for being here. What I'm trying to understand is this self-making process. And one of the things in the world that I notice is we use these labels all the time. Male, female, black, white. I could go on forever. What part does that play in the self-making process?
Sure. So when you're talking about labels, are you talking particularly about contemporary sort of language around identity?
Yes.
Okay, just clarifying. So I think contemporary language around identity is a really interesting, it's simultaneously a response to and a kind of phenomenon downstream of what I'm describing. I think at its best, I don't even know what calling it wokeism sounds very demeaning, and I don't mean that, whereas social justice feels almost dated, but the questions of identity broadly on the progressive left, I think at their best are a recognition of a lot of the insufficiency of these ideas of self-creation and quote unquote liberal modernity. There is something that we do not choose that affects us, and we need to contend with that very seriously. But I think that we are so far as a culture enmeshed in and embedded in these assumptions that it becomes very easy for, just as we have our New Yorker tote bag or our the fancy water, I don't know how to say it. We have all of these different ways of signaling things about ourselves. I think that in many cases, though not in all, it is very easy for language of identity to kind of function as a certain kind of personal branding, especially in like when it's in your Twitter bio, when it's how you like part of a kind of, in a lot of creative fields, it's sort of normal for your identity to be part of like how you would present yourself in like a professional bio or a byline. And I think that tension is precisely because there is a very real and vital desire to resist, well, everything about us is chosen, and yet a sort of discomfort with what it might mean to, like, what does it mean to have an identity? Is it just like, well, this is just a thing I say about myself, or is it, this is a political community I have responsibilities to, this is something that shapes my experience? Like I think that we perhaps do not have a robust sense of what it means to declare certain identities, even as I think that there's a lot of good in wanting to resist a purely choice-centric vision of the self.
Pete?
I think being in the church setting, when you were speaking, I always see an interesting parallel between like contemporary self-made culture and the rise of the prosperity gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And some of Kay Fowler's writing kind of critiquing that. And I was curious if you could address that or.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's, New Thought and the prosperity gospel have so much in common. There's a lot of kind of overlap, both ideologically in terms of major sort of formative figures, even people like someone like Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking, big sort of 50s self-help guy. Also, fun fact, also be Trump's personal pastor and a major influence on Donald Trump. But like, there's a sort of huge overlap in this idea that material rewards in this world are, that something in the universe, some force, maybe God, maybe energy, depending on your precise sort of where you're coming from, wants you to be rich and happy and successful. And that material prosperity in particular and health are somehow emblematic or rewards for either having lived a good life, or in the case of like, actually I think interestingly in the case of the prosperity gospel, as well as a lot of you thought, wanting it badly enough, like tithing in the right way, doing kind of focusing your attention and energy and desire in the right manner. So there's an absolutely huge overlap, and I think this is it is downstream of this sort of what I've called the democratic model of self-making, this very the sacralization of desire as bound up with the energy of the universe. And I don't want to like dismiss elements of it wholesale. I think it would be like ridiculous to say living a good life does not bring certain kinds of happiness. I think probably those of us who have friends and are kind and have community probably are happier than those of us who don't, sure. But that sort of vision of certain kinds of peace or grace that come from living the gospel should not be equated with exterior markers of success, whether it is wealth or health or a happy marriage. Sorry, I'll give some money.
So, at this time of year, there are a lot of symbols of joy to be observed and to participate in, but it's also a season for many people to remember circumstances, people who are gone. And I wonder, in the context of your writing and the self-making of the individual, where you come in on the process that either extreme joy or extreme grief can play in the person that you make of yourself after such an event.
Oof, it's a personal question to answer right now. I think in my own life, at least, the suffering and the joy are often very intertwined. My faith has been at a its strongest when everything is stripped away but the gospel. And that's not to say that everyone should suffer. I kind of want nobody. I don't want anyone to go through anything awful ever. Like, I want us all to be sort of happy orbs floating through space. That would be very nice. But I think that the moments that we come face to face with the brokenness of the world are the ones where we come face to face with reality rather than the illusions that we've built for ourselves. And I think to recognize that, especially in this Advent, a season of waiting and of penitence and of hope, that the moments of prayer and the moments of waiting are the moments when we are less distracted from God than we might be in moments of more illusory contentment. So yeah, I think this is a very good season for. I mean, if you're gonna suffer, now's as good a time as any, I guess.
Jim, do you have a question?
Sure. I have two, if that's not cheating.
One and a half.
I've noticed, I wonder if you've noticed too, that recently, for quite a long time, one of the worst slurs that you can direct against anybody or anything or any kind of idea is that it's essentialist. And I wonder if you have any, generally thought to be a bad thing to be essentialist. I wonder if you have any thoughts on why that might, if you've noticed that and why that might be so.
Could you give me an example, just to make sure I understand you correctly? Like,
Yeah. Say it again.
okay, so could you give me an example of what you mean, just to clarify? I want to make sure I understand you.
For example, that that there's anything innate in human nature.
I understand, yes. Yeah, I think what I love about being Episcopalian is I can be a moderate on about everything. I think that there is a discomfort with the ideas of innateness, because there's a discomfort, culturally speaking, with the idea that there is something inherent in what we do not choose. At the same time, I think, as particularly historically speaking, like a lot of that discomfort is very warranted. The idea that we can reduce, because so often certain kinds of essentialism go hand in hand with certain kinds of reduction of the human person. We have you fall into this category, and you're born in this way, and therefore we can sort of say X, Y thing about you. So I think I can understand why one might be rightly suspicious of essentialism. At the same time, I do think that you are right to point out that perhaps our wariness of it blinds us to the fact that there are certain truths about ourselves. Sometimes, perhaps in a sort of statistic way, X number of women tend to perform better on X test, and X number of women perform better on Y test, or what have you. I'm throwing out an example without any numbers or force behind that. But I think that that kind of data might be useful when you're running a scientific trial. It might be useful when you're, looking at certain kinds of policy. But I don't know that data is. That data is particularly useful when dealing with another human being. And I think the kind of interpersonal relationships we have demand that we look at one another as whole human beings. And I think that in that context, there is a danger, both essential, in that any kind of essentializing would be a danger, except that insofar as, and I think this is where I'm kind of pushing back against myself, the idea that we cannot have certain kinds of dialogue across certain kinds of lived experience, that there's not something essential about being human, that we cannot have kind of political communities or intellectual communities in our own human exchange. I would like us to have an essential idea of humanness, at least. even as I think I'm very wary of naming it, because I think historically speaking, whenever we try to say that X thing makes us human, whether it's reason or, you know, the ability just to talk or the capacity, I mean, the capacity for love, I'm like, probably like the least bad, but I'm still have my own wariness of it. Like, I don't think essentializing any trait and saying that is the thing that makes us human does anything more than create a way that people can be more or less human. And that is a road that I do not want to go down.
Can I just follow up?
Sure.
Would you see a Christological problem? I mean, Christians are affirming that the second person of the Trinity takes our nature on himself. If there is no nature, then...
But I think I absolutely think there is a nature. I'm completely with you. I think that what I don't think is that that nature can be expressed by something other than itself. You know, Christ did not take on, Christ's human nature is not the ability to do math, to give a sort of, you know, silly example, but like,
It's a good example.
sure. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
When you mentioned Walter Benjamin's art in the age of mechanical reproduction, there was something about that fear of being reproducible that I thought was fascinating. Does that fear of being reproduced lead to a less authentic sense of self, because we're kind of creating these pastiche, like simulacra, copy without an original kind of personalities or personas?
That's great. Yeah, that's a great question. So, short answer, yes. Long answer, I think I hate the word authenticity. I like allergic to it. I worry that like authenticity doesn't mean the same thing as truth. And I like everything useful I could possibly say about this, Charles Taylor has already read them, so I'm not going to get into it. But I think that it's true that our fear of being reproducible, especially now in the internet, like at least the dandies didn't have Instagram. Like at least there was some kind of physical embodiment that meant that, you know, our fear of being reproducible could happen in a particular context. Now I think it becomes like we sort of almost like pastiche ourselves. It's easy to collage ourselves, say, I'm this sort of person, I'm that, like, I like dark academia, and I'm a little bit of a goth, and, you know, I've got, like, flapper this, and I, for those of you who are on Twitter, and I'm so sorry for all of you, including myself, if you are, the sort of way that people will have, like, X, Y, Z thing in their Twitter bios is, like, these are the things that I define myself on. And, you know, I always think of, you know, God's sort of, I am what I am. I think that is a sort of a model for what reality is that it is not predicated upon anything. It just is. And I certainly don't know how to either just be, or especially as a writer, express that just being except by imperfect analogy. And I think when that fear of reproducing, or that fear of not being an original, and like what's like this like fetishization of originality which is such a distinct, like a really distinctly modern phenomenon, like Enlightenment, or particularly an Enlightenment phenomenon. Like de Sade is obsessed with being original, with like horrific, gross, creepy results. To be an original can only ever be to define oneself against those who are not original. And so like my concern is not just that we are self-creation out of fear is pastiche. It's also that self-creation out of fear demands the conception of people who are not self-creators and who are therefore less human.
But does that compromise the development of a spiritual self, because we're working towards, this kind of pastiche, superficial?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yes, absolutely it does. Like, you know, who you are before God, I don't think God cares about what you put in your Twitter bio. And I think that probably that selfhood, that like whoever we truly are, does have to be in the context of these things being stripped away.
So self-making is solely for recognition by others. If you had a Facebook page and your only friend could be God, would you self-make?
I think I would want to self-disclose to God, but I don't think I would want to self-make. But I think that, I mean, I guess I'm lucky, God already knows, so I don't have to.
Don't have to have a Facebook page.
Yeah, but I think that, again, I want to draw the distinction between self-disclosure and self-making, because I think one of them is also like, we aren't alone. I mean, in some sense we're alone with God, but we are in a world with other people, and our relationships with other people are how we understand, or help us to understand a God, and particularly a God who became man. And so, short to say, like, yes, if our only friend was God, would we have a Facebook page? No, but also, how, again, back to Manly Hopkins, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Like, how do we recognize one another if we don't figure out how to express whatever it is we're trying to express, which, maybe the bad version of it is this kind of self-making, but there is a good version, or there is a good that is being sought by it, I think.
I'm going to be kind of bad. I know I shouldn't do this, but it's the last one of these for a while, and I'm going to ask the last question. Sorry. And then, I'll ask for the last question. So in arts and faith circles here, and I've seen it more broadly too, I've seen like two different sort of theological approaches to arts and faith. And one, I've noticed, it seems to be sort of focused on this idea of co-creation with God, that we're sort of, God has made us to be creators. And there's something true and beautiful about that. But then that seems like the danger, and the other school seems to focus more on sort of the distinction between creator and creature. And like, there's a relation, but it's not sort of an equal relation. I don't know. So there's issues of grace, of what it means to be a human. I don't know. Is there any insight you have into that?
Well, I want to answer this as a novelist. When I'm not doing this, I write novels. Fun fact, my next one comes out in 3 weeks. You could pre-order it if you want. It's called Here in Avalon. That's my personal branding for you. But here, as a novelist, I wrestle with this all the time. Like, how do I think about being a Christian and think about wariness of self-creation and and the unreality of the internet age and the unreality of simulacra, and then like sit down and write a novel? Like, how am I? Like, who am I to do that? And increasingly, I've come to the conclusion, soft conclusion, this is not my, I don't have a book on this or anything, this is just what I've been thinking about myself, that as a novelist, I'm not trying to create reality, I am not trying to create anything. What I am trying to do is disclose an attempt to understand reality. And I think, I'm with Plato on this in a certain sense. If you're just trying to create an image of something that is realistic, you're doing it wrong. This is why so much of AI art is creepy and gross. This is also this is why I hate CGI in movies. I just watched The Muppets Christmas Carol, and it's so much better visually than any CGI, anything. And the reason, the Muppets Christmas Carol got me thinking about this, is that what you're watching when you're watching Muppets dance around Scrooge, if you haven't seen it, you all should. You're watching human beings trying to interpret what it means to be human, and these puppets, they don't look realistic, but they're kind of doing things, they're real. And I think that distinction between trying to even represent reality or capture reality and trying to look at another human being work out the messiness of trying to understand what reality is. I'm looking at that painting there right now. I'm not looking at a reflection of reality exactly. I'm looking at someone wrestling with reality and feeling a little closer to another human being through that, and maybe other human beings who are looking at it, and maybe, I think and I think that I have become the only way I'm able to justify myself as a novelist without being this is a terrible thing, I must never write fiction ever again, it is unchristian of me, is to see the act of writing fiction as an invitation for other people to wrestle with me, not trying to be a miniature God creating my own little world.
Thank you so much. Let's give Tara Burton a hand.
Thank you go.
It's been such a joy. I'm going to let you escape so that you
I'll
can
take
go.
a moment, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be in that room.
Yeah, good deal.
Come talk to me.
So Tara, as she mentioned, we have books out here for sale. eShaver will be selling Self-Made, and then Tara will be there to sign books and to talk about the books if you want to talk about it with her. And like she mentioned, she also has a new book coming out. Once again, it is called Here in Avalon in January. And eShaver is totally going to carry it. I know it, so you can get it from there. Good deal. All right. You can head off. A couple last closing bits of information. There is still food back there, so eat it, because someone's got to eat it. And I think the bar will still be open for a little bit. If you have kids in youth group, you have 15 minutes before they're exiled to Whitaker Street. Thank you all for being a part of these, and for I hope they've been a blessing to you, and we'll pray that God will continue to bless this ministry as we go forward. So thank you all. God bless you, and go buy books, please. All right.